Talking about good API documentation.
Yes. So hi everybody. I've really enjoyed hearing everyone's presentations so far, and many have been really relevant to what I'm doing, and lots of good ideas that I thought related to my presentation as well. So I hope to incorporate those either in my talk or in the slides when I update them later. So first of all, what makes good API documentation? And I got interested in this subject because, of course, I had an API product that I had to document. At our company, we have a very sophisticated underlying product with tens of thousands of functions that's really hard for anyone to understand. And so that's one problem, but another problem was we thought if we make an API, then we can have a developer who gets access to the capabilities that our program has, and we can make these capabilities much more widely available than if we expect every user to become an expert in the product. We can get a developer who develops using the API and uses the capabilities of the product, and then people can use that product. And that's basically what an API is. You are a developer over here. You have a program with a lot of capabilities over here. An API lets you, as the developer over here, use the capabilities of that program over there. And so the first thing I wanted to do, and I was told to do, is look at some examples of some really good API docs there are on the web. Well, first of all, what I found is if the API is well constructed in the first place, it makes it a lot easier to write good API docs. If your API is consistent, then it's much easier to make consistent docs. So here were some of the API docs that were recommended to me, and I took a good look at most of these. It turns out that Netflix has mostly ended their developer API program, but the API doc that's on the web is pretty good. Twitter is excellent, and I saw that there's going to be Twitter speakers later this afternoon, so I'm looking forward to hearing from them. The GitHub API doc is really good. You can see the Facebook API in action almost everywhere you go. Whenever you have to log in using Facebook, somebody has decided to use the Facebook API. Similarly with PayPal API. The Flickr API documentation is really good. I'm not seeing as many examples of it being used, but I really enjoy it. I really enjoyed looking at it. And I know it's a bit of a geeky thing to do, to spend a few afternoons perusing API documentation, but I really recommend it to get ideas. Now for Twitter in particular, let's just take a look here. Well, first, one thing is, now I haven't done this myself in my own API documentation, is I really appreciate how they made this graphical, made what's a really dry subject, put some interesting graphics in there and made the concept clearer that way. With GitHub, I didn't bring that page up, but if you take a look at it, everything is basically on one page, and you can find everything you need to know from it. And with the Flickr API Garden, developers have made a lot of different apps using the Flickr API, so it's a really good way to look at samples and see how to use the Flickr API. And they also have a feature where you can do online authentication and test things out. I find it very helpful. And so I started to think, are there API standards? I haven't found any specific API standards, but it seems like very popular APIs almost tend to become de facto standards. And I really recommend the site ProgrammableWeb.com. It has tens of thousands of APIs, including some mashups. So I was just looking at some examples earlier today. So right now they have 11,365 APIs and over 7,000 mashups. And just as a simple example, if you wanted to use this exchange rate API in your program, they make it available. And it's also a really good place, I found, to find API documentation that is not so good. You can see what doesn't work. And a little bit afraid to mention it in case somebody is from that company, but one example of subpar API documentation that I found was MapQuest. So anyway, for both good and for bad, you can look at programableweb.com, follow the links, and see what they have. Now, one thing I found really helpful was that our development team decided to use the Django REST framework for developing one of the APIs. We had both a REST API and an RPC over HTTP API. And they implemented Swagger so that we could easily see the verbs that you can apply to different objects. And I looked some at the Atlassian site, and they seem to have a similar concept with the REST browser. Again, it allows you to test content and see how it works, see how the API works. So here's an example of the Swagger implementation. So I'll just switch over here to the web. I hope you can see this. So what are the operations that you can do on this object or this resource called pet? You can do all these different verbs. And let's say you want to find more out about this one. Simple. So I don't think that the Swagger, that setting up your API with Swagger will solve all of your documentation problems, but it's a really good way to concisely set up reference information. And if you don't use Swagger, I would recommend using something that gives you the same sort of capabilities. And the way we did it at my company, we have something similar here. Sorry, I thought I could get that, but it appears I can't. Okay, so here's a static version of it. So here's the URL. We have an object called model. This shows the various model objects that I've created in my own personal instance of it. And then I decide, okay, and then you can, if I wanted to, I can post some content here to create a new model, allowing me to test the API. And what goes in the post box? Something that looks like this. Now, what this shows you here is the API documentation does not tell you everything about this product. We have another reference manual that tells you about the various functions. This right here is a function. And you have to refer to that in order to know how to write this definition string. But it does allow you to test the way the object is created with post. And similarly here, suppose I want to view the contents of the model by slug. Back we had all the different names for them. Sorry, they're not names, slug IDs for the models. But I decide to look at this one, and then I can see the details about that model. And then programmatically, if someone needed this information, then they would access it through their program and get a hold of it. So I'm focusing mostly on REST APIs. I know there are a lot of different types of APIs, but this is what I've spent most of my time recently on, and they're also quite easy to describe. Basically, you have some verbs like get, post, put, delete. Also patch, but that one is more controversial. At least in my company, people say, no, it's not really RESTful. So then we have nouns, which are also called objects or resources. And you figure out how to apply the verbs to the nouns, and that's API documentation, which should be simple, right? But there's a bit more to it than that, because for one thing, the objects might interact together. There's different ways of filtering the objects. There's different ways of searching. But as long as you keep this general framework in mind, and as long as your developers develop in this general way, it really makes life a lot easier when it comes to documentation. So what should good API documentation have? yes, a description of what it is, which seems fairly obvious, but it's not always clear. Good tutorials, good examples. Now this was somewhat controversial at my company because they say, well, if the developer using our API is a good developer, he or she is not going to need to have an actual example. Sure, they need the API documented, but they don't need to have a working sample. I somewhat disagree, but I ran out of time anyways, so a moot point. And I noticed in the talk I just attended with Brian Helmig, he was mentioning how much users were able to get out of actual working sample applications, so I would definitely recommend that as well. A sandbox test environment. So whether you're doing that with Swagger, PayPal, for example, has a sandbox you can test with, but it's extremely helpful for the user. It's helpful both for the writer, for the person doing the documentation, but it's also very helpful for the user. And then, of course, frequently asked questions. And there's all sorts of stuff that's not obvious the more you think about it. And so here's an example of a feature that I really like in the Twitter API documentation. So it says pages that link to follow button or pages that link to whatever resource they're talking about. And then if you look here, because it can often be difficult to figure out exactly what you're trying to find. So this really helps. I don't have this implemented in my own documentation, but it's something I would really like to do and I can really see the value in it. When you're not sure what you're looking for, it really helps. Another thing that's really helpful, of course, just like with any type of documentation, clear versioning. And when you are coding, I suggest to use the version number of the API. This will save problems later. Now, a feature that I don't often see, but I think would be useful, is if you have sample code, put some information about when or how it was verified or under what conditions. Now I have to say I failed on this point because my first sample that I put in the code that was in the documentation that was supposed to work because it was extremely similar to something else and I didn't quite have time to test it, didn't turn out to actually work the way I thought it would. So I think it's very important to verify it, whether it's a QA department or another person on your team. And then of course mention the FAQ, the working examples. And then suggestions for how to use the API. Again, maybe it's obvious to everybody, but most likely it's not. So, and it's true the customers might have their own ideas about how they can use the API, but just give them some suggestions to get started with. And I mentioned the importance of test environments, and PayPal has this, which is very helpful. And again, APIs tend to change, and I think, again, following Twitter's lead, here's what Twitter says about how to keep track of changes in the Twitter API. So first of all, they have a dedicated Twitter account for it, naturally. They have a blog, and I would love to start this. It makes it a lot easier to add new features rather than just releasing a new set of the documentation. Discussions, if that's applicable. For my particular set of clients who are extremely closed-mouth financial firms, probably not, but if people are willing to have discussions, it's great. And then Twitter, of course, has all their documentation on the website, and you can see the documents that have been recently updated. And then if you're wondering about when a feature is going to come into play, then you can consult the platform calendar. So I'll just talk a bit about my strategy for creating API docs. So we have this new API product, and it's just being developed from the get-go. And to be honest, I was a bit at sea about how I was going to document it. I didn't have much an idea what it was going to look like, and it's pretty hard to start documenting in thin air. But just like somebody else said today, it's better to start writing something wrong and get it corrected than write nothing at all when you're not sure. So, and I was fortunate. Our dev team did a fairly good initial spec. And so my first cut of the user documentation was just taking that spec and writing a user manual based on what that spec seemed to imply. And then I started with that, and then arranged a meeting with the developers, and I said, this is what I've written based on the spec you have, and here are some questions that have come out of trying to write a user manual based on the spec you have. And so we went through it very carefully, and it brought up a lot of points, both for the developers and especially for my understanding, so that I could write better. And then they, for a time, they kept updating the docs, and then I'd have to go and figure it, updating the spec, and then I'd have to go and see how it was updated and change my doc. But then it turned out, they said, no, we don't want to update the spec anymore because it's too much trouble to keep it up to date. If we think we should just do it by conversation and by Jira, which is questionable. I understand why they decide to do it that way, but I had to be even more on top of what things were happening and more proactive with my questions. So soon, finally, I got a model that I could actually test with, and I also worked closely with the QA team. The QA team was working on a bunch of different test cases, and so I'd see how they would do their test case, and I would see how I could use that test case in my documentation. And so with that, going back and forth with me talking to the developers, me using the API via Swagger, talking to the QA team and seeing what test cases they were working on, finally we got a documentation set together, which is this one. And I missed the last presentation about minimally viable documentation, and I sort of feel like what I have here is minimally viable. There's so many different improvements that I would like to make, but I'll just go through what it does have and then what improvements I could make. So first of all, the about. This was something that I worked on with the product management department, well, actually the product manager. He had specific things that he wanted this to say to emphasize our product direction. And this may or may not be particularly helpful to the developer. It was very important to setting the tone for our new product. And then I gave an overview. And then, for example, the basics. So again, you know, HTTP 1.1 is supported. This is version 1. Here's how you set the server URL. So very general things, but important. And then stuff like, well, what formats does this API support? This changed several times, so it was important to keep up to date. And then how are responses and requests formulated? This is something that's very specific to our product, but you may have something similar in your own product. People had to know this somewhat arcane markup language in order to properly use the API. And then, so we get down to here. By this point, now we're using it. So we start with the verbs. Those are the ones we used in our version. We just described the HTTP endpoints. And then, really important, of course, is the objects. And the objects changed somewhat, mostly because we weren't able to do as many as we hoped to do when we started. But so that was necessary to keep this up to date. And then describe the properties of each object. And then the tricky part, I haven't talked much about the RPC over HTTP API, but I also had to discuss how the RPC over HTTP API worked, which is a little bit less well formulated than how REST API works. It's not as standardized. And then I had to describe how to use them together. Sorry about this, it's flopping around a bit at me. I'm using remote desktop. And then I have the FAQ section. And our first set of customers, so to speak, for this was the professional services department, the client services department. And so they went over it with eagle eyes. They found errors in it, of course. So I've made some fixes for those. There's lots of things I would like to do with the code samples as far as better formatting. Again, it was just a matter of time, mainly, because the development cycle was extremely compressed for such a complex product. And like I said, I would like to do some sample applications. Client services is going to work on that as well. And to be honest, they are much more skilled developers than I am, so it might be the best use of resources if they actually do those sample applications. So the most important thing was to have a proper description of the API, and with examples of using the API, and then the sample apps, I would say, is a secondary thing, although still significant. And here are some of the sources that I used in this talk. I really recommend Sarah Maddox's blog. She writes about all different types of APIs and all types of API documentation. And she'll be giving a talk at the STC Summit. I really found it helpful when I was making this foray into API documentation. The Stack Overflow link, I mean, it's only one page, but very helpful. This API Academy link has lots of useful YouTube videos about developing APIs and API documentation. The Particle Lab article has a lot of information about what makes good API documentation. And again, I wasn't really able to find anything profound or unique in what I did, and my time, due to time, I felt that I didn't do everything that I should have done, but at least I know where to start, and I know what a good objective is. And so I'd be happy to talk about API documentation or API or documentation in general. And welcome questions. Okay, sorry.
So we're out of time for